We are joined by Cauldron Pool writer and Specky contributor Rod Lampard. Rod, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks.
Look, I brought you on to talk about a harrowing subject that flies under the radar. Now, we hear all day about free Palestine, but never about the silent genocide of Christians in Nigeria at the hands of Islamic terror groups and even Islamic herders who go from village to village murdering women and children. Now, they do so without a word from the international community. Well over the weekend, we had another tragedy. Several people were murdered and their church burned to the ground. They've met again in the ashes of their church to pray. We're just going to show a quick clip to the audience so they can see what happened.
We praise your name, to protect us.
Now, Rod, this is really sad. Why don't we hear about the persecution of Christians?
That's a really good question. I think it's just not politically convenient. It's just like talking about domestic violence in the LGBT community. You just don't do it. And it's not something you bring up around, in polite society, because it forces, I think, people to actually step back and say, is this actually happening? And then it confronts them with the reality, especially when we are taught in the West that Islam is a religion of peace, alongside that whole Marxist idea that, we can have this equality utopia, which we know is, from history, is complete crap, to be blunt. And it's not just Nigeria. We have examples, and I've documented examples from China, India, Egypt, Pakistan, Nicaragua, and even Nigeria itself. In 2022, there was reported that Nigerians identified 46% of Christians, 46% of Nigerians identified as Christian and 53% Muslim. And I think that imbalance is having a huge legal and cultural impact on social cohesion in the country, because prior to Islamist uprisings, Muslim and Christian got along. So there's a political element that I think people don't want to talk about when it comes to Islam and the political structure. The religion itself is inherently political, whereas in the West, we're built on church and state foundations. There's a clear separation when it comes to one wields the gospel, that's the church, and the state wields the sword under the authority of God, and both exist under that umbrella. So both are accountable to God on an equal footing, and one influences the other. And so we've lost that in the West, that kind of understanding. Today it's, oh no, you have separation of church and state as well, get God out of politics. Well, in the Middle East, in North Africa, in good parts of Asia, that doesn't happen. God is part of politics there. And I think that whole idea of get God out of politics and don't bring your religion into this, in the West, is making us ignorant, and I think dangerously so.
Well, if our viewers are wondering how bad the genocide against Christians in Nigeria is, 62,000 have been murdered since the year 2000. These are religiously motivated murders that happen as a result, and then their land is acquired. So we have Muslims taking 59,000 square kilometres of land from Christians in recent years in that area. We've also seen 23 priests kidnapped in 2022. And according to the International Society for Civil Liberties and the Rule of Law, 14 million Christians have fled their homes, 2,300 Christian schools were destroyed, and 18,000 churches were burned to the ground. Now, Islamic forces have hacked to death 8,222 Christians in Nigeria in 2023 alone. That's 13 months for those terrible crimes to take place. Now, there's not a word from our work universities. There's not a word from our Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, who gives our money to terror groups under the name of aid. Rod, do Christian lives matter to progressive politicians in the West?
I won't say they don't. I think they just turn a blind eye to it. Have a look at what happened in Nigeria specifically. The case of Yahya Aminu Sharif. She was a 22-year-old singer, and she was accused of blaspheming Islam on WhatsApp in August 2020. And she was, I think she was beheaded for her crime. She was charged, and the court found her guilty, and they upheld that. And there was no outcry. This is 2022. This is the peak of Black Lives Matter. This is, the real issue. If you're looking at lives and Christian lives in particular, we see the political system and its hypocrisy. 50 Christians were in Nigeria were massacred in 2022, in June 2022, and you've pointed out some of that stuff. The Marxian-like world were silent. Blinken and Biden, not a word, not even an act of sympathy. In Christchurch, a guy shoots up a mosque. The world is in meltdown. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but I think biblically speaking, Christians are to expect this. We're to be. Jesus said we're going to be hated by the world, and the world is not going to. They hated him, so they're going to hate us, and to expect the same treatment.
Well, it's not only Nigeria where Christians are under attack. In China, Albanese's a lover on the global stage. They hold the record for closing the most churches in 2020, where China shut down 3,088 churches. Christianity is actually the fastest growing religion in China, and yet Xi Jinping, apparently without any comment from the United Nations, burns Bibles, destroys crosses and other Christian relics, and forces Christians to sign documents renouncing their faith while hanging portraits of Mao and Xi Jinping on the wall above their altars. Now, where is the West? It seems that the Christian West would rather assist in the rise of Islam than rebuild a single Christian church, whether that be in China or elsewhere. It's almost like the Christian West has completely abandoned Christianity, especially in places like China, which are influential to our trade.
Well, I don't think it's abandoned it fully. I think it wants to abandon because it's abandoned its roots. If the West has abandoned Christianity, full stop. It's rejected it. They're saying we're living in a post-Christian nations and post-Christian society. They've got no interest in the suffering Christians elsewhere, and that unfortunately that means they'll have no real interest in the suffering of non-Christians and Muslims in those countries. Because in Nigeria, it's not just Christians who are being persecuted; it's cultural Muslims who are being brought under this, political law, the Sharia, the system, even the constitution has been brought into that. Egypt has a similar kind of thing. In fact, Sharia is inside Egypt's constitution. And one example from Egypt was a Christian Coptic, Rami Kamel. I reported on him like over 3 or 4 years, followed his case and kept writing stuff on it. And I think I seem to be the only one that was even taking an interest in that, apart from his advocates and those organizations trying to get him out of prison. And he was in prison for criticizing the Egyptian government when he was speaking out on a global stage using social media about the cover up there, which is where Muslims kidnap Coptic women and force them to marry into the Muslim faith. It's called Jihad of the Womb, which is what the Coptic Solidarity group calls it. And they've done extensive reporting on that and studies and investigated it. It's quite shocking, but you wouldn't hear it on everyday news or mainstream media. You wouldn't even hear it, like I said, talked about in polite conversation, because it blows this myth of Islam as a religion and peace out of the water, just as it criticizes the whole point of Black Lives Matter, which, it's a Marxist movement. So what do you expect? It even brings into consideration, even critique, the idea of multiculturalism in the West and things like that. And I think the examples of the martyrs who I would call them Christian martyrs in these countries, who aren't suffering because they're taking the sword to the state or to the people to wage a war, a holy war, to bring about God's kingdom, they're being persecuted because they won't align with a state that's forcing them to bring about God's kingdom in the sense of Allah and Muhammad, his prophet. And I think that when you look at those examples, and there are other ones in Nicaragua, there's, as I mentioned, Bishop Rolando Alvarez. He was charged for treason, allegedly for spreading, and get this, misinformation, hate speech, and inciting violence. It sounds a heck of a lot like what's going on in the West and what they're trying to bring in here. So I would say, in answer to the question, maybe there's some kind of coordination going on here where they see, the West sees, politicians in the West see this happening in these countries and say, well, we can borrow that and apply that here, because we no longer have a Christian moral foundation. It's all progressive. They claim to be building it on the Enlightenment and the reality with liberalism, but the reality is it's an abandonment of that, especially classical liberalism. When you're looking at freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association, all those things, it's really the politicization of a bunch of things. We see that with science, with COVID and medicine. We see that with the LGBT movement. That's highly politicized to the point where it's almost fascist. And I would argue that in a great way it is. And you see that again in examples coming from within the West itself. UK teacher Joshua Sutcliffe, he was fired and banned from teaching because he refused to affirm a teenager's pronoun. The guy has an immaculate record. He's a great teacher, and he had all the the references you would expect to have for that kind of thing. And so, okay, people testified on his behalf. The trans tribunal he went before didn't care. He refused to go along with the narrative. So therefore, he has to be pushed out. I mean, he in a way, I guess he was charged with blasphemy, the same as what's happening in Nigeria, the same as what's happening in Pakistan, which recently I wrote about. And there's a great quote from Asia Bibi's legendary lawyer, and it's Asia Bibi. She was similar thing. She was in prison, put on a sentenced to death because she was apparently blasphemed Muhammad. And her lawyer had said that essentially these blasphemy laws are a murder of justice. They're a weaponization of religion, they're a weaponization of politics, they're a weaponization of ideology, and that lawfare is starting to see that lawfare flow down into the West. And I think it's like they're completely ignorant of our politicians. I think they see it and go, well, we can apply that here. And that's quite dangerous, because if you think about that, if they're going to get away with it in China, in North Korea, in Pakistan, India, it's just a different name here. It's just branded differently.
Yeah, well, I mean, you talked about the jihad of the womb. That actually sounds like a form of sexual slavery. You're not going to see any Me Too protesters or Black Lives Matter protesters talking about what's happening to women in these countries because they're Christian, because they're poor, and because they serve absolutely no political purpose when it comes to dismantling the West, which is all they really care about. Any narrative that comes to dismantling the West is important. Anything that challenges that, they don't want to hear about. Now, we talked about, why the West is bringing these things in. Personally, I think most Western politicians have no idea what kind of fire they're playing with. They don't come from societies where religious wars happen, where genocides actually take place. And so you've seen it already start here in Australia, where a lot of these pro-Palestinian politicians are suddenly shocked at the violence against their own officers, against what they're seeing being said on the streets. They thought it'd all just be nice little political, social justice politics, and now they're like, oh, this stuff is actually really scary when it's on your streets. And yes, that's what we try to tell them for ages. But you talked about the intersection of hate speech laws and misinformation laws. In the UK, one of the first things that Labor leader Keir Starmer has said that he wants to do is to bring in blasphemy laws to make it illegal to criticise Islam in the UK. Now, as Suella Braverman said, and I quote, "Islamicists are bullying Britain into submission." It was part of a long, heartfelt letter that she wrote about what's going on. Now, the question is, how did we go so wrong? Do you have any final thoughts here about how we went from a progressive society that says we value women, we value religious equality, we want to protect you from harmful things, and yet we say that Christianity is an oppressive patriarchy, but we love Islam? I mean, how do they even say this with a straight face? Yeah,
I'll just say first, Suella Braverman is a legend. I love almost everything she says. I think she has the answer. I think she came up with the answer recently when she said that multiculturalism has failed. I think things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, are actually propping up or designed to prop up multiculturalism, the illusion of this, because that gives these politicians, or when I say these politicians, I mean the bureaucratic caste to the political class, it gives them power. It maintains the illusion that we can all go along, or that all cultures are equal, to quote the United Nations, which if you say all cultures aren't equal, they'll label you a racist. If you look at the 2017 Declaration for Indigenous Human Rights, it's on there. I think Jean Beth Gershon, one of my favorite feminist writers, she said in her book Democracy on Trial, she asked the question, can democracy survive what it allows? I think she was being tactical at that point in time. This was around 2000, 2001. I think what she really meaning was, can the West survive what multiculturalism allows? I think without the backbone and resolve of the Christian faith, the Christian doctrines, that back and other the solid foundation of classical liberal values, with Christ at its head, the idea of faith that seeks understanding is very Christian. I think, therefore I am. Descartes comes out of that. It's the challenges of those kinds of things that I think we've lost. And I think that the dethroning of Christ in the West, so the word I'm trying to look for there is the ejecting of that Christian foundation, or the destruction of that, which includes the family unit, which includes good government, includes open debate, clear thinking, those kinds of things, good straight morality, I think is what's causing the issues that we're having. And I think that consequence of rejecting Christ as Lord means that we have a bunch of people running around as if and as though they are Lord, but the reality is, as history attests, that no man or woman can claim to be true Lord without Christ as his or her king, and that goes for Rome. It goes for every other empire that's fallen. Christianity survived, and I think that's the other side of this, is that these civilizations and countries will pass away, but the word of God will remain forever. That's what the promise is, and I think when you look at Christians and Christianity's survival throughout history, even the Enlightenment itself, it was interrogated to the max through the Enlightenment. It's probably the only religion that's really had that rigorous pulling apart and putting back together. It survived that, and there was predictions that the church won't survive. The church, Christianity will fade away. This was like hundreds of years ago. People were predicting that because of this movement. Well, the reality is just bolstered it. So.
Well, let's hope that it might have survived the test of the Enlightenment, but it may not survive multiculturalism and our progressive politicians. But let's hope that we're wrong. Look, thank you so much for joining us here today on Spectator TV.